So today we are going to be looking at a video by a YouTube channel called Emma Thorne, and the video is called "The Gender Critical Movement Has It All Wrong." This person is somebody who, as far as I can tell, seems like, a decent person, a not just, I'm basing this on a cursory look at kind of just their videos, and they seem to be entirely entertaining, seemingly coming from a place of like genuine, I guess, critical thinking and intrigue, and also seemingly a degree of like honesty and stuff like that. But that's just based on a cursory look at the kind of videos they're doing. Whatever, we're going to watch the video and see what they have to say.
The reality of this conversation is, sex is not binary and immutable. Trans people do not have a secret agenda. That is a conspiracy. Trans people are disproportionately affected by hate crime.
Okay, first of all, I just want to say right out of the bat, like, those are two very different things. I know there were three things said, but like, sex is not binary and immutable is a claim about like scientific reality versus like trans people aren't involved in a conspiracy. That's obviously a much more kind of political question. And of course, it's also taking, notice it's kind of combining, obviously nobody really believes trans people are involved in some kind of conspiracy. That's ridiculous. I mean, it's essentially the exact same thing as like an MRA YouTuber or streamer opening up the video and saying, hey, you know what? Men aren't all involved in a conspiracy. And it's like, well, yeah, sure. That's a very kind of reductive understanding of this, more complicated issue. Usually actual, I guess like most real problems in the world can almost never be reduced down to a conspiracy. But that doesn't mean that it's, illegitimate to have concerns, about the issue. And obviously, yeah, I've never met anyone who thinks that there's like a trans conspiracy. But obviously, it's interesting that that thing, which is kind of so, I guess, silly that there's nobody I even know who believes it, is kind of being put alongside the claim that sex is binary and immutable, as if like they're similarly silly statements, when of course they're radically different. One is, of course, yes, a bit silly. The other one is just actual reality.
They are disproportionately affected by discrimination. That includes in the workplace, access to housing, public spaces, the
disproportionately affected by discrimination. Obviously, there's the kind of standard point that a lot of the time with trans identity, you won't necessarily, for example, I could be trans identified and just keeping it a secret, and I'm obviously not being disproportionately affected. That's the problem. Trans identity is not something that actually has any real world effect on people. It's basically just a belief. But obviously, apart from that, there's the fact that when it comes to things like, I think it might be violent crime in general, but certainly, kind of homicide, trans-identified individuals are actually killed at a lower rate proportionally than the average person in the UK. And I think in the US, it's slightly more sophisticated. It's once you account for race, they are killed at a lower rate than the average population. But certainly, if you talk about, I guess, like violent crime between the sexes, then biological females are overwhelmingly going to be the victims. Whereas there's really not many instances of biological males being killed by biological females.
Science supports trans people. The science says that sex is not binary, is not immutable, gender critical.
Okay, so again, you get like the science says, which is the main thing. Like, these people, again, they literally act like science is some kind of, just like science says stuff. Science is a method, and it's a method that can be wrong, and not necessarily because the method is wrong, but just because of various issues. But the other thing is, like, science also has limitations in terms of what it can do. There's the fact that science can't really answer the question, because ultimately, when you talk about trans people, you're getting at a question of, does it make sense to say that a biological male can be a woman? And science can't really offer up an answer to that question, because it's, at least to some degree, a philosophical question. It's like saying that science can tell us, whether somebody belongs to a particular racial group. And of course, to some extent, science can tell us that person's genetics. It can tell us certain realities about their biological makeup, but it can't tell us, whether or not, taking into account the kind of, I guess, broader sociological reality of how particular kind of racial groups are understood, whether or not it makes sense to include somebody in that group. But the point is, these people just say, the science says, blah, blah, blah. But actually you say, well, in what sense does the science say that? And usually they can't offer up a particularly good, response to that more direct challenge. Sorry, the other thing I want to say about science, of course, because I say this all the time, the big thing with science is if science says that sex is not a binary, then one of the ideas in philosophy of science is instrumentalism, which basically means that the way science works is when you use it to achieve results. And obviously that's why it's called instrumentalism, because you use it as an instrument. So when you had scientific studies on certain demographics, it wouldn't say male and female. It would be a spectrum. It would be shown in some kind of continuous format from most male to most female. When, of course, I think we can all agree that one of the benefits of science is using, and I'm pretty sure this person is like a kind of an atheist, a skeptic, that kind of thing. I bet they're the kind of person who would say, talk about how great science is because of all the kind of medical advances we've had. But it's interesting, obviously I agree, science is very much concerned with your medical health. But when often you need to check with your doctor, you need to get symptoms checked out, whatever else, what they'll want to know is, are you male or female? Again, they don't want to know, like if they ask your height, or if they want to know your height, they'll measure you because your height is a spectrum. It's something which is continuous. It's something where there is a specific thing that either goes up or down. That's not how it is with biological sex. So yeah, it just doesn't work.
How you personally feel about gender identity should not impact the human rights of others. Hello, lucky people.
Nobody has a human right for me to affirm a claim is true.
I fully anticipate a lot of hate on this particular video.
You definitely shouldn't hate somebody like this, because it's pretty clear to me. I'm strongly suspecting this is somebody who is a kind of a well-meaning person who just has bought into some bad ideas. This isn't like, because there are some people out there who are very much almost like, even then, I don't think they necessarily know what they're doing. I think they're ignorant, but they're kind of intentionally and willfully ignorant. And obviously those people you can be a bit more, disdainful of. But, this person I suspect is actually, trying to be a good person, trying to actually engage with ideas honestly and openly. And yeah, we're just going to help them with that.
I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that gender critical is expansive to include non-feminists. The gender critical movement, I'll discuss this more shortly, the gender critical movement has been repeatedly, more recently, aligning themselves with people who are anti-women's rights.
Okay, no, I didn't like where that's going. I mean, look, here's the thing. It was kind of correct to say that I think one of the reasons why people use the term gender critical is not necessarily, okay, here's the thing, it's not necessarily that it's inclusive of people who aren't feminist, although certainly I would imagine a lot of gender critical people fall into the camp of like biological males can't be feminists, and therefore, obviously, for example, based on that, I couldn't really call myself a TERF, because obviously I'm a biological male. But the other point is that it needs to be inclusive of people who aren't radical feminists, because I think we're all clear on the fact that J.K. Rowling is not a radical feminist. I don't think anyone's really arguing that. I mean, I don't think she said anything kind of, Dworkinish or anything like that. So, obviously it's inclusive of people who aren't radical feminists. But the other thing is, what I've always said is that I feel like GC kind of at this point has two potential definitions. There's the broad definition, which is basically anybody who, as I've said before, is critical of the idea that gender identities are valid or transgender identities are valid, and simply believes instead that the only thing that makes somebody a man is them being biologically male, the only thing that makes somebody as a woman is them being biologically female. And that broad definition would include, obviously, conservatives. It would include basically anybody anywhere on the spectrum. The kind of more restrictive definition of gender critical is specifically people who are not only critical of the idea that being a man or woman is about something beyond biological reality, but are also critical of the idea that being a man or woman should carry with it any roles or expectations beyond biological reality. So, for example, Matt Walsh, in the expansive definition, would be gender critical because he's critical of the idea of trans identity, he's critical of the idea that being a man or woman is defined by anything beyond biological reality. But Matt Walsh is not gender critical in the more restrictive definition because he is not critical of the idea that there should be roles and expectations attached to being a man or woman beyond biological reality. He obviously, I think, very clearly believes that men are supposed to be like macho and, kind of meet all these certain criteria meant to be. And of course, I think he's far more likely to impose his beliefs on, or, have, let's say, stronger opinions about how women should be, which is kind of feminine and, caregivers and all that kind of stuff. And of course, yeah, Matt Walsh is a kind of social conservative traditionalist. That's very much obvious. So that's kind of my situation on it. And, I can see people using either definition and, saying, well, there are kind of conservative traditionalist gender critical people, but I can also see people, and I think maybe it makes more sense to argue the other thing, which is actually, no, if you are gender critical, it has to mean not just critical of transgender identity, but of gender roles and expectations. That's what you're critical of in the gender thing. But then the claim was the gender critical movement has been aligning itself with people on the conservative right. And that's really not true. Basically, what will happen is occasionally a gender critical person, and by gender critical I mean in the kind of more restrictive sense of somebody who is broadly, let's say, socially progressive on gender, will say, hey, this traditional conservative person made a good point. That's usually, and of course, I mean, I've done that. I've aligned myself because, of course, you probably know that I responded to somebody else responding to Matt Walsh. And in doing so, I was implicitly defending Matt Walsh because I was, of course, challenging this person's objections to Matt Walsh. So in doing that, I was clearly aligning myself with Matt Walsh in a very limited sense, but I wasn't placing myself on his side. I wasn't saying, like, Matt Walsh is my buddy and my comrade, and we're here in the trenches together, because that's really not how I view it. And I know other people have their different opinions on it. And I think I've kind of already said this. It's like basically some people are like, oh, it's purely an alliance of convenience. You need to do it, but whatever. Other people who will be like, oh, let's just be neutral. Let's kind of have sort of, I guess, a non-aggression pact, if you like. And then, of course, there are people who are like, no, we need to fight just as hard against people like Matt Walsh as we do against, people like whoever else, the TRAs. So there's kind of different opinions on it. But certainly it's not accurate to say that the gender critical movement can be fairly said to have aligned itself enthusiastically with the conservative right.
The other reason I think that gender critical is taken off as another term is because, like we see with online scams, once a group name or a company name has a certain amount of negativity associated with it, it benefits them to change the name and move on.
I really can't deal with this idea that gender critical people are hiding their true beliefs. And it's I've literally never met a gender critical person like that before. I don't know of any gender critical person who could be accused of hiding their true beliefs. Certainly, you don't have to, I'm not hiding anything. I'll say basically the full extent of what I believe when it comes to kind of trans identity and basically everything as it relates to gender critical, pretty much whenever the opportunity arises. Everybody knows what gender critical means, and that's actually why we use it. And to be honest, it's, if you're being real, a better term than TERF for that reason. I wanted to throw out another reason, this is the reason which isn't mentioned, which why I think TERF is not so much of a good term as gender critical. And it's because TERF is, if you look at what it stands for, trans exclusionary radical feminist. And the implication there is that feminism should include trans identified biological males, aka so-called trans women. And that's an assumption. The problem is if you say I'm trans exclusionary, it makes it sound as if you're the one taking taking biological males out of the movement, as if biological males had any place in that movement in the first place. When, of course, actually, you're not trans exclusionary. Other people are trans inclusionary. They're the ones saying, oh, we want to bring biological males. We want to say biological males are women. We want to bring biological males into, a women's rights movement for biological females. So actually, that's, I think, one reason why talking about being exclusionary is kind of silly.
They purport that sex is binary and immutable, that you cannot change your sex. You are either male or female, as you are assigned at birth. They believe that is what the science supports, and that's the end of the discussion. Trans people are mistaken, unwell. Their ideas of what causes trans people are different from person to person, but they essentially believe that there are men and women, and that is that.
Okay, I mean that was all a bit messy, like everything kind of said there. First of all, I will say this: this is something which, at the end of the day, I mean, yes, that is something which gender critical people would overwhelmingly believe. It's worth noting, of course, you don't have so on the kind of binary point. I've said before, because it's true, that even if sex weren't a binary, because in like 0.0000001%, or whatever, like in a tiny fraction of instances, we might actually say, oh, this person is neither male nor female. Let's suppose that's true. Again, is it true? Well, that's, again, you'd have to look at every single individual, like, kind of medical anomaly, and obviously that's quite a big ask. But we can just say, okay, let's say that's hypothetically true. Would that validate trans identities? No, because obviously still the vast majority of people are either male or female. So it doesn't need to be binary. Of course, the main point is it immutable? And of course, immutable, I mean, that is a quite ambiguous term. And, if you don't know what I mean by that, well, maybe we'll get into it. If the immutable point is actually spoken about in more detail, then I'll get into why I think that it can be a bit more kind of nebulous. And then kind of that was then related to, therefore trans-identified people aren't valid, which of course is not necessarily true. I mean, it's actually possible somebody could believe, because of course the thing that we have heard from some people is, well, sex is binary, but gender isn't. Gender is a spectrum, and it's your gender that makes you a man or woman. So those would be people who do believe sex is binary and immutable, but also affirm trans identities. So, I mean, and there are people who, yes, will say, actually, I'm literally, there are biological males who will claim to be biologically female. And of course, those people, I mean, the funny thing is a lot of trans-identified individuals or TRAs will tell you those people don't even exist. They'll say everybody understands that sex is, different, and that obviously everyone understands that trans women aren't biologically female. But actually, of course, that's not true. Plenty of people will claim they are. But that's the point. It's a whole, you'll notice, I mean, essentially the point I'm getting at is it's just a bit of it's bulldozing over a whole load of kind of complexities with that kind of summary. And to be honest, I think, I could even get into the whole, there's either men or women. And it's like, well, I mean, that's kind of the whole non-binary thing, which is, a secondary issue.
Their campaigning, then, is largely around segregation, I want to say. You largely see them campaigning against things like gender-neutral bathrooms, or campaigning for trans women to be barred from women's bathrooms, things like...
Well, again, the thing is, it's not really about segregation, right? Because, again, you could believe that we should have separate spaces for men and women, but you believe that some women are biologically male. So again, segregation isn't really the point. The point is, given that we do have segregation, we do have men's spaces, women's spaces, men's sport, women's sport. By the way, the women's European Championship is happening in the UK or in England right now. So there's a fun fact. But yeah, basically, seeing as we already do have these distinctions, to what should these distinctions actually, what reality should these distinctions actually be kind of accommodating? What actual distinction? And of course, the argument of gender critical feminists and other gender critical people would be, it should be about biological males and biological females having separate spaces. So the decision to specifically mention segregation is clearly intended to kind of manipulatively put the focus on, oh, segregation, that's the bad thing. But of course, it's not actually making a real argument, is it?
Largely what you see is people using this faux science-based ideology to be transphobic, to hurt trans people, to out trans people. They've done a lot of doxing, stalking, harassing. It's a bit like...
I mean, okay, first of all, I just want to say, like, the whole using the science to be transphobic. Well, again, if by transphobic, you literally just mean acknowledging the reality that biological males aren't women and biological females aren't men, well, you're basically saying using the science to accurately describe the science. On the subject of like doxing and all that kind of stuff, well, essentially at that point, you're just getting into your personal beefs with how, and I would say correct beefs, if you're being accurate, with how certain individuals have behaved. I'm somebody here right now making an argument that I don't think that trans identity makes much sense. And to then say, well, people who agree with you may have doxed some people. It's like, okay, that's bad, but it's irrelevant.
The majority of trans activists that I've seen over the last year or so have said, we believe that gender and sex are different things, and we just want you to respect our gender. So in that respect, we shouldn't even need to have the science portion of the discussion.
Well, look, I mean, here's the thing. What even is the relevance of talking about biological sex? And the only relevance of it, really, would be if TRAs can argue that biological sex is not a kind of sufficiently clear way of understanding reality, I guess, such that it can't properly function as a way to kind of, I guess, group people together. And obviously, in the case, essentially group people together into the categories of man and woman. Like, basically, that's it. Because, of course, when you think about it, I mean, that's essentially what the gender-critical position is in reverse. So the whole criticism of the gender-critical position, the whole criticism from the gender-critical position against the TRA position is that gender identity and trans identity doesn't make much sense. There is no clear, essentially, I mean, the real simple thing is that it's circular, right? It's, well, I identify as a woman because I identify as a woman because I identify as a woman, and so on forever. And then, of course, the alternative is you define it by stereotypes. You say, well, you're a woman if you're feminine. You're a woman if you live your life as a woman. You're a woman if you fulfill the role of a woman. And then the criticism is, well, that's sexist. So essentially, when you break it down, the gender-critical argument is, well, the TRAs have their reasons for saying that a biological male can be a woman, but the ways they understand women don't work. So the obvious counter would be to say, well, the gender-critical people have their argument of, what makes somebody a woman and its biological sex, and then you would say that the biological sex definition doesn't work. That would be the kind of proper way to employ a biological discussion in defense of trans identity. The issue is I don't think that it's actually an argument that will end well for TRAs.
Sex is not as simple as your chromosomes, your genitalia, your gametes. It just isn't.
Yeah, okay. That's fine. It's definitely not as simple as your chromosomes. I mean, again, obviously, the actual thing is phenotype. Is your phenotype organized around facilitating the function of small or large gametes in sexual reproduction, which I think is a pretty damn good definition. And essentially, it means that, obviously, the point is, kind of the analogy I was thinking about recently is like when it comes to chromosomes, and I thought this was quite a good analogy, is it's like somebody who is phenotypically, let's say, I don't even know if this is possible. My specific DSD knowledge is not great, but let's say somebody who is phenotypically biologically male, but XX. Well, the analogy I was kind of thinking of is it's like if you got some instructions for building an oven, but then you accidentally built a fridge. Well, what have you got at the end of that? You've got a fridge, right? Because, so in essence, the chromosomes, if you like, and again, I know this is simplistic, but the chromosomes are like the instructions. But you don't judge what something is by the instructions. You judge what something is by what it is. And obviously, a phenotypical biological male is a phenotypical biological male regardless of their chromosomes or their hormones or anything else. The question is, when you actually have somebody stood in front of you, do they have a body that would be conducive, if it were functioning kind of properly sexually, conducive to facilitating the function of the small gamete in sexual reproduction?
Fortunately, intersex people have been so invisible for so long that doesn't help a lot of people understand the conversation better.
Look, speaking of not helping people understand the conversation better, the term intersex is a horrible way of talking about the reality of differences of sexual development. Essentially, the question is, well, at what point do you say somebody is intersex? Because obviously, some examples of things that might make somebody be described as intersex is just, I think one of them is literally like if a biological female has an enlarged clitoris, that could mean she's considered intersex, which is kind of silly. Okay, that means she's no longer biologically female? Of course not. It can be all sorts of other things. For example, it can be a biological male has some ovarian tissue tucked away somewhere that is of no reproductive function whatsoever. It doesn't actually do anything. And yet some people might say, well, that they have ovarian tissue, therefore they're intersex. The point is, it's really difficult to define. If you wanted to say, so essentially, and obviously this is the other point I make, most intersex conditions actually specifically have a different function depending on whether or not they're affecting biological females or biological males. So of course, that means that intersex actually proves and reaffirms the reality of the sex binary. Now, the only other situation is, of course, you could say, and I kind of already touched on this, well, what if there is somebody who is so kind of, let's say, differently developed sexually that you literally just are struggling, it's almost impossible to say that they are phenotypically geared towards any reproductive function, or indeed that they're phenotypically geared towards both reproductive functions, or that they're geared towards the reproduction involving some kind of hypothetical third gamete. Those would be the questions. Now, as far as I know, I know that Riley Grace Rochon has a research document where the claim is, there are people who actually can be accurately described as literally not having any kind of clear gamete that their phenotype would be, organized around facilitating the function of. But it's literally there are 3 examples given, and several of them are from many decades ago. Or, I say several of them, obviously there's only 3. I think 2 of them are from many decades ago, the 1980s, the 1970s, things like that. So if we are, let's grant that, let's be generous, okay? We're talking then about something that occurs, and this is again, being very generous, saying, okay, this intersex, or, this difference of sexual development that actually could be described, or could be perhaps mistaken for, if you like, between the 2 sexes. This is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. And it's not helpful to conflate biological females with enlarged clitorises, biological males with ovarian tissue just tucked away somewhere of no consequence, people who have a karyotypical abnormality that has no actual kind of expression in their kind of physiological makeup. It's not helpful to group all of these people together with some hypothetical person who is not clearly recognizable as either phenotype, and say, it's just intersex. And that lack of, kind of utility and helpfulness in actually understanding the reality of biological sex is really the main reason why intersex just doesn't come up that often. Because it actually, I think, comes up about, well, let's be honest, it comes up far more often than it would be appropriate for it to.
Somebody like Matt Walsh pointing out that we cannot simply define woman is actually an accurate representation of the science and not the state of the woke media. This is from an article on Sapiens.
Okay, no. Okay, so there you go. There the claim was, and I know it's going to get into, an article, and maybe that article is going to substantiate the point, but I just want to go through what was said there. So the claim is, well, the fact we can't define woman is not because, we're stupid or our beliefs are incoherent, but because of a limitation to the science. Now, first of all, you will notice right there, the issue. That's assuming that woman is a biological category. So, you'll notice, like I said, these people don't really believe what they believe, what they claim to believe, because when you actually give them half a minute to kind of, actually talk for themselves, they will accidentally say something that shows that they believe woman is a biological category. And there you have the claim that, well, the reason we can't define woman is because biological sex is ambiguous. And it's well, hold on a minute, what does that have to do with how you're defining woman? I thought woman wasn't a biological category. So again, pretty easy kind of point for me to make, but there you go. These people contradict themselves. They contradict their own beliefs.
There is no simple dichotomy between female and male. Genitals, hormone levels, and chromosomes are not reliable determinants of sex, because, for example, there are people...
Okay, I just want to say, you're saying, it's not simple. And like, okay, I can kind of agree with that. I mean, look, because what I say, like I say, well, it's about what gamete is your phenotype organized around facilitating the reproductive function of. And, I mean, that sounds very kind of concise and fancy. But of course, is it simple? Well, no, you could actually really break it down and say, well, what does it actually mean? And of course, I think part of it is I'm appealing to a general sense that you will actually know what I'm talking about. You know that, for example, it will be things like having, if let's say if you want to facilitate the function of the small gamete in sexual reproduction, you need a, male genitalia to do the, I guess, insemination, a very weird kind of overly scientific term for it, but there you go. You need testicles, you need, a significant degree of testosterone to kind of help with that sort of stuff. You need, but I mean, the other point is, and again, it's kind of like, the whole, we are so sexually dimorphic that it comes, I mean, we all know it comes down to things like even your shoulder, width and stuff like that. These are all things that are part, when you view when you view the human body holistically, of what it means to be biologically male. And the point is, it's not as if there is one singular thing that makes you biologically male. It's about, like I say, what you're so I'm just typing insemination in all capitals. But yeah, it's about like what your whole body is organized around, and that's not a kind of simple thing. And the problem is, again, this is it. There is never like going to be, for most things, there's not going to be like very simple definitions. It's always going to be a little bit complicated. Like I'm pretty sure defining species, like loads of other scientific concepts, are complicated, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't draw these distinctions, and we shouldn't act as if these distinctions are real and kind of definitive in how we should kind of affirm them. That's kind of my stance. Like, just because we can't necessarily say, like, in simple terms exactly what makes somebody a member of a particular species doesn't mean we should just say, well, I guess everybody can just be whatever they want. You want to be a tiger, have fun.
There are women with testosterone outside the typical female range. Numerous studies have found that the differences between...
And again, obviously, so those specific examples of DSDs, again, it's like women with testosterone outside the normal range. Okay, so what? Again, like, if somebody is, again, you could be talking about somebody who literally is entirely able to, like I say, facilitate the function of the large gamete in sexual reproduction, but their testosterone's out of the normal range. Okay, they're still biologically female. That's the reality.
Of an explicit binary is especially evident in humans, given the complex neurobiologies, life histories, and morphological dynamics in our species.
Okay, so the claim was, okay, so first of all, man/woman is not a biological term because there's no biological binary, which, I mean, that doesn't necessarily follow, but whatever. Again, I'm always inclined to go back to think, okay, so you're saying there's no explicit binary. Okay, so actually, if that's your conclusion, prove that is a scientifically valid conclusion by using that in your science. If that's what you're saying, and you're saying, oh, this is what the science says, okay, next time I see a study, I don't want to see that study distinguishing between biological males and biological females. I want it distinguishing between rates of biological femaleness and degrees of biological maleness, because that's apparently that's what the science should be doing, but it doesn't. Almost as if actually these people deep down know that there are biological males and biological females, and when you do a test or like report on some results, you don't need to know the chromosomes of every single person you talk about. These biological sex is observable, and it's observable in a multitude of ways, and often ways that kind of act as substitutes, I guess, potential substitutes for each other. So if, for example, there's one way you can't actually do it because maybe there is a difference of sexual development, which means that, for example, their testosterone level isn't normal, or, perhaps their genitals aren't quite what you're expecting, or whatever else, whatever it is, you can still look towards other things because, like I say, it's holistic.
Now I'm using some stuff sourced from Scientific American. Again, this will be down below. A newly fertilized embryo initially develops without any indication of its sex. At around 5 weeks, a group of cells clump together to form the bipotential primordium. These cells are neither male nor female, but have the potential to turn into testes, ovaries, or neither.
Wait. I think I've already responded to this. Let me just confirm. Yep. Okay, I've already responded to this. I responded to this on stream like a week or so ago. So yeah, you can it's so the video the article's called "Stop Using Phony Science to Justify Transphobia," and it's in the Scientific American. And yeah, I've already responded to it and gone through it, so we don't even need to worry about this because we've already done. Don't worry, everybody, we dealt with it already.
Initiates the process of male sex differentiation, but during adulthood, you have genes like DMRT1.
See, I mean, what you will notice is that all of this is just like here's the thing. I'm sat here, and to be honest, if I were being really strict, I wouldn't have needed to respond to anything that's been said, really, because actually none of it relates to trans identity. You're just like, all of this stuff is just there to give the kind of veneer of scienciness. But actually, when it comes to what really matters, which is, does biological sex function as a suitable referent for whether we should understand somebody as a man or a woman, the answer seems to remain unaffected. Hello, there is a little doggy, which is fine. It's the price you get for being in a hot, I was going to say a hot country, England. No, but being in a heat wave. Sometimes when that dog does hear me, he does get excited and bark, but that's usually only when I bark back.
Gonads can change and exhibit the characteristics of the opposite sex. Without these players constantly active, certain components of your biological sex can change.
There we go. Yeah. Okay, there we go. Sorry. Yeah, I know I've already responded to this, but I just want to touch on it again. So, because I kind of knew that was what it was, but I just wanted to make sure. So, yeah, that was a claim. Certain components of your biological sex can change, but here's the thing: you'll notice certain components is irrelevant when we've realized that your biological sex is an entirely holistic thing. I mean, it's also worth noting, like, it's a bit of a weird thing to say because your biological sex changes a huge amount when components of your biological sex change during like puberty. But I guess this is saying, your biological sex can change. Components of your biological sex can change from that typically associated with the male to that typically associated with the female, which is actually, when you think about it, an entirely uninteresting point because, of course, high amounts of testosterone are typically associated with biological males, but literally your level of testosterone will fluctuate like throughout the day. So the point is, this is the problem, if you literally think that your biological sex is a spectrum determined by a kind of, aggregate of all of the potential components of your biological sex, then I suppose, you believe that like you're just ticking up and down as a biological male or biological female, depending on like how much testosterone you've got in you. But that's not how it works. And that's not, again, it's not a helpful way of understanding this concept. Here's the other issue, okay, with understanding things is like, it's like components of your biological sex instead of phenotype. And this is it, okay. Your phenotype is an expression of your genotype, meaning that something is not relevant to your biological sex unless it is a direct expression of your genotype. The problem is that if you define biological sex with reference to just like vague components of maleness, then I guess it carries with it the implication, for example, that if you accidentally get your nuts chopped off, then you become less biologically male. Because, obviously having testicles is, I think we can all agree, a component of biological sex. But I guess it's also something that can go away. So does that mean you cease to be as biologically male? The problem is it's all just a mess. And it's like a mess which is so easily avoided by instead just saying, well, holistically, overall, what function is your phenotype organized around when it comes to sexual reproduction?
The gender critical or the TERF movement hinges on the idea that sex is immutable. You begin your life with this sex and that is it.
Which of course is not true, because clownfish exist. Like, that's it. I mean, obviously, I feel like people always sleep on the fact that the point about biological sex is that it applies across the animal kingdom, which is really cool. It reminds you that everybody, it's the thing I always like, that literally even the people who are sat there denying like biological sex and denying the binary of biological sex and who will even like be like, oh, why are you defining it like this with this weird thing about like phenotypes being organized around facilitating the function of certain gametes in reproduction. Even those people who are getting confused by that or annoyed by that or whatever else are only here because there is a succession of hundreds of millions of years of biological females reproducing with biological males. Every single person right now denying biological sex right now, their existence is only they're only here existing to deny biological sex because of a succession of often unthinking organisms who are nonetheless able to recognize the kind of implication of biological sex when it came to passing on their genes. That's the reality. But of course, and I just say that because I think it's important to bear in mind that this biological sex thing, it isn't just a scientific construct that came along. It is a scientific construct, but it's not something that we invented kind of without any real world reference. No, it's something which it's a reality we inherited from, the very organisms to whom we, from whom we descend via the reality of sexual reproduction. And with that said, it's worth noting, animals have biological sex, and clownfish have biological sex. And in the case of clownfish, of course, their sex is not immutable in some sense. But the point is, when you say sex is immutable, well, it can change if your genotype allows that. Now, of course, human genotypes do not allow for spontaneous sex change, but there are some species where their genotype does allow for spontaneous sex change. Ours doesn't. There is nothing written in my genotype that could suddenly allow my phenotype to change from biologically male to biologically female. The problem is, I said that, the idea of like biological sex being immutable is complicated. And the reason why is because, well, if by immutable we mean simply there is nothing you can do to get around the fact that your biological sex is real, well, that's true. Now, if immutable means can't change, that's not as true. Again, like obviously there are some species where it can change. Even in humans, the reality of how your biological sex is expressed and how your biological sex manifests can change. Nobody ever changes from being biological male to being biologically female who's a human being. The main takeaway there is that ultimately, when we say your biological sex is immutable, even if your biological sex can change, it's still your biological sex and you still can't deny it. So that's kind of the funny thing here. Like, even if this were true, okay, fine, you know what? Okay, I'll say this right now. Let's assume that it is possible that actually somewhere hidden in the human genotype, there is something written in the genotype that would allow our phenotype to change from biological male to biological female or vice versa. Let's suppose that's somewhere. And let's suppose that someday somebody gradually, or maybe even just in an instant, changes from being biologically male to biologically female. If that happens, I will say, you know what? That person is now a woman. Right? Like, that's the thing. I would say, you know what? Okay, guess what? We now have somebody who was a biological male but is now a woman. They're only a woman because they're now biologically female, but whatever. The point is, if that happens, fine. Okay, I guess, good job. But the point is, right now, as far as somebody who is obviously biologically male claiming to be a woman is concerned, it's irrelevant.
And that is not science. That is not science. Sex is not a binary. It's not a 1 or 0. It's a combination of characteristics, and your sex characteristics can change.
Again, here's the thing. The claim is sex is not a binary, it's not a 1 or a 0, it's a combination of characteristics. But, the problem with that is that you could say the exact same thing. You could say binary code isn't a binary, because while it's a 1 and a 0, those 1s and 0s can be written in different colors. They can be different shapes. They can be blah, blah, blah. It's worth noting, for example, a lot of the time, binary literally isn't a 1 or a 0. It's an on or an off. Like, that's the thing. Like, obviously in computers, I think actually it's just on or off, not 1 or 0. Isn't like barcode binary? And in that case, okay, it's basically black or white. So if it's black, that's one thing. If it's white, it's the other thing. Obviously, that's the thing. Like, if your argument is it's not binary because, oh, it can be complicated in terms of how it appears in reality. Well, guess what? Binary code is also complicated in terms of how it can appear in reality. Binary code can be expressed in a number of different ways, just like biological sex. There is this assumption, and it's an assumption which, the main point that I would want to stress is that TRAs seem to have this wrong-headed idea that spectra better account for complexity than binaries, and that's simply not true. Binaries and spectra, the binary if you like, is kind of irrelevant to complexity. You can have very simple spectra, right? Like, height, that's pretty simple, right? It's just get a measuring tape, simple. Okay, but then, obviously, you can have, I can't be bothered to think of a complicated spectrum, sorry. But, conversely, I'm sure you could think of a much more complicated spectrum. But of course, like I say, height is definitely a spectrum, and that is incredibly simple. So the point is you can have simple spectrum, or simple spectra, and you can have complicated spectra. And of course, you can also have simple binary, but you can also have complicated binaries. Binary does not mean simple, and spectrum does not mean complicated. So you can't just evidence the claim that sex is a spectrum by saying it's complicated, because it's possible that those complexities can be better accounted for by a binary than they can by a spectrum. And what I always say is, look, if it's a spectrum, then what's the x-axis? And see if you can, I would challenge somebody to organize all of the complexity of sex on a spectrum. Because if apparently the complexity of sex is what shows that sex is a spectrum, then you should be able to organize it onto a spectrum. You should be able to say, well, this person's this much male and this person's this much female and blah, blah, blah. And, literally right down to the individual degree, you should be able to do it, because that's how spectra work. But they can't do that.
Appearance, behavior, these come from genes interacting, your hormones, your environment, half a century of empirical.
I do like that just sudden, just unambiguous shout out to biological essentialism right there. Okay, apparently your behavior is a sexual characteristic.
Is slightly larger in males than females, but it's unclear if that size difference indicates differently wired STNPOAs in males versus females.
I think this is still literally, by the way, reading from the article I've already responded to. So
trans people possess values both in between those of typical cisgender males and females, both before and after transitioning. Another study found that for certain brain regions, See, this is so weird, because it's literally hey, there's no such thing as male brains and female brains. And then it's literally being oh, by the way, the reason we know why trans identities are valid is because trans people have male brains or female brains. Literally, it's appealing to the idea of male brains and female brains to argue that trans identities are valid. And it's well, how does that work? You've got to be consistent. If you're going to say that male and female brains are nonsense, which by the way they are, you can't then say, well, that's why trans identities are valid. And that, by the way, it's just a terrible way to the whole idea of male and female brain is incoherent. Only explains about 56% of an individual's testosterone, suggesting many other influences on hormones. Furthermore, measurements of sex hormone levels in any one individual...
It literally is, it's literally just a complete brain dump, where, you're left wondering, okay, so why is what you're saying relevant? Because it's literally just vague information. Literally, I feel like they do this a lot. It does remind me of the video I did I responded to by Ponderful recently, the whole why GC is not feminist. And it was literally just a massive just brain dump. Obviously, you guys, if you're the YouTube people, you didn't see just how much nonsense there was just at the beginning, because I edited most of it out. But it was literally just a brain dump of, here's everything I know about first wave feminism, with no apparent point. And it's kind of the same thing here. It's just, again, I would say here's everything I know, but here it's more here's a random smattering of what I have read verbatim on biological sex. To what end? I'm not sure. It's just yeah, okay, I agree. It's kind of a complicated thing.
Estrogen, typically linked to feminine coded.
Estrogen? Excuse me, the kangaroo stole my estrogen. It sounds like the way Kiwi would say estrogen. Where's my estrogen gun? That's how they talk.
Estrogen, typically linked to feminine coded behavior, also plays a role in masculine coded dominance, power, social scenarios.
Okay, so basically all it's saying right now, again, not that anyone thought this was relevant because it isn't, but just in case, you were me and you weren't paying attention. So the point is, it's not as if female hormone equals feminine behavior, male hormone equals masculine behavior. So obviously, if you're gender critical, you already knew that because, of course, like gender critical people, I'm pretty sure gender critical people did not believe that the female hormone automatically forces women to be feminine. I'm pretty sure gender critical people recognize that gender is a nonsense social construct. Yeah, I wanted to talk about how funny the title is because it's the gender critical movement has it all wrong, and it's so far this is just so unrelated to the gender critical movement. I mean, we had some vague stuff at the beginning, which I guess was kind of relevant. But now we just have so much stuff, which I think a gender critical person could just sit through all of this entirely neutral faced. Just literally the only things that warrant a response is the occasional moments where this person's and this shows why it's actually a spectrum, because everything complicated is a spectrum. It's I guess, I don't know, does that mean insert something complicated? The continuity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a spectrum. There we go. Is that relevant? The Marvel, do people still like that?
Trans people definitely exist, and they are incredibly helpful in helping us understand these sex characteristics. So that's the science side.
I don't understand. Look, if trans identity has nothing to do with biological sex, which would seem to be, unless you're a trans medicalist, I don't even know, yeah, the argument, I don't know any trans person who argues, well, I'm trans because of my biological sex. I know people who would say that their biological sex changes because they're trans. I don't know people who say they're trans because of their biological sex. So I don't see how trans identity would help us understand biological sex.
Multiple studies show that transgender people face heightened discrimination that leads to disproportionately high levels of poverty, unemployment, homelessness, inadequate medical care, incarceration, and violence. Such has been the case with many a minority group throughout history.
I mean, look, here's the thing, okay? So this person is apparently, from what I've gathered, an atheist. They're into the whole atheism thing. So it's can you imagine, for a second, if they sat down to watch a video called Atheists Are Wrong About Everything, and the video started off, and it was just somebody, the first half of it was somebody explaining this scientific concept that, let's say, was kind of tangentially related to atheism, whatever you want it to be. It doesn't really matter. Let's say, for example, it was just them explaining in detail how the Big Bang is very complicated. Let's say, for example. And then every now and then they'd say, and the fact the Big Bang is complicated means that God must have done it. They just throw that out randomly. And then they go through all of that, explaining the Big Bang in complicated detail, making this completely unjustified claim of and therefore God must have done it. And then they switch and are and now let's get to the other thing. Theists are really persecuted. People who believe in God are really persecuted, blah, blah, blah. Do you think that would make this person then say, oh, okay, I guess God does exist? No, they would still be skeptical of that claim. And in the exact same sense, if you tell me a biological male can be a woman, and I sit there and think, well, that doesn't really seem to make much sense. Why would a biological male be a woman? What does a woman even mean if a biological male can be a woman? And then I sit down and somebody just explains the specific kind of signifiers of biological sex in elaborate detail with no clear purpose except for arbitrarily at random points saying, and therefore it must be a spectrum, as if that's even true, and then just suddenly starts launching into and also, people who believe, biological males who believe they're women face extreme amounts of persecution. It's okay, does that make them right about their claims of identity? I mean, look, I don't want to completely ignore the kind of claims of discrimination. Admittedly, I'm partially inclined to, because I'm aware that I feel like my battery is going to run out of camera I know I intentionally misspoke, in not that long. which, I mean, I probably should end the stream now. I guess I'm going to have to end the stream pretty much now, actually. In fact, you know what? Yeah, let's end the stream now. And then we'll pick up on like the kind of sociological side later on. So everybody, that was part 1. I don't know if I'm going to edit it at exactly this point, but yeah, I think maybe we'll be able to get it done in 2 parts. Like, it doesn't seem to be very substantial. I'm not even sure if we have enough kind of stuff here for 1 substantial part, because I'm gonna try and edit it down quite a bit. But yeah, now I guess the good news is that I no longer need to tell everyone to go and look at Twitch, which is fun. So, because I think realistically, I probably might as well just stream to YouTube now. So I'm streaming to both YouTube and Twitch, so the Twitch people are cool. But yeah, whatever. The point is that based on that, you if you're on the YouTube, you can get involved in it. And again, in theory, it should be 7:30. It wasn't 7:30 this time because it was hot, and therefore I just didn't feel like coming upstairs and just doing this. I was like, literally, I think at 7:30 I was still eating my evening meal because it's just everything when it's a heat wave. It's just everything goes later into the night. It's just how it is. I mean, Lord knows it's going to take me until like 2 a.m. to fall asleep tonight. I'm not good with heat. Not at all. Anyway, but yeah, I'll just say, I guess I might as well do a proper outro. So yeah, please do like, share, subscribe if you haven't already. Like if you haven't already. And that goes for people watching the stream right now, and also the people watching this when it gets edited and uploaded as like a more concise video. If you want to give on Patreon, that's really appreciated. And if you want to give them PayPal, that's really appreciated. I'll also say, by the way, some of you might be wondering what about like super chats and stuff like that. Yeah, at some point I might work that out and like make it so you guys can help out. Hello, Radical Ramblings, by the way. Have you been here this whole time? Because like I it's fun seeing people who I'm subscribed to showing up. So hello, you're just in time to watch me leave. So yeah, that's that. Oh, I guess I'll just say thank you to my current patrons.